Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all having a wonderful week. We're into the fourth week of Foundations, and every Monday I like to do my best of one, best of three meta review. I really enjoy talking about all of the decks throughout the weeks, even if they are starting to get a little bit more, solidly defined as the meta settles, as we await the new expansion in January. So, if you're new here, what I like to do is I like to use Untapped, which is a third-party tracker. That way I can kind of remove my bias and just go off of what the data says. And still, I have a lot of experience with Magic the Gathering. I've been playing since Portal in '97, so hopefully I can give you some good insights, because this is what I do for hours every day. So with that, let's get started. So Tier 1, number 1 spot is still mono red. Part of when you're looking at decks from bronze to mythic specifically, if it's a really simple strategy, then it's going to perform better if you're not, one of the best players out there, right? So I think that is partly why mono red tends to always be in number 1. That being said, though, if you are interested in some off meta picks, there is a very diverse meta. There are lots of viable strategies. So this is really to help people who are new to Magic the Gathering or returning to Magic the Gathering and kind of want to understand what's happening in Standard. Because every week there's always somebody who says, thank you for being so comprehensive. This is my, first time. So enough of that, though. So what I like to do throughout the weeks is track how the cards are changing. That way we can kind of have something to talk about for those who are watching every single week. And I will also go over the matchups as well as what to look for in your opening hand in case, in case you're new to Magic the Gathering. Because I think we have a lot of people who are returning or at least checking out Magic the Gathering for the first time, with kind of being the whole point of Foundations was to rebuild the player base. So I've been bumping into a lot of new players on Twitch and such. So this week we can see that they dropped the obliterating. Oh, the other reason why I list out everything that's changing is so that if you are new and you're kind of like thinking about maybe crafting the deck, you can kind of figure out what's changing. Maybe don't craft the cards that are coming in and out. Because those are kind of like the flex spots, and it can also just give you your own ideas if you want to take it and try it out in your own deck, right? So this week we're dropping the 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt, which is the 1 in a red to deal 4 damage and exile a target, and that one's particularly good against the Slasher and Mono Black. And instead we're bumping the Lightning Strike back up to 4 copies, and we're dropping the 4 copies of Monstrous Rage, which I find very surprising, but I think it has to do with how much mono black is on the ladder, because the Monstrous Rage is something that can get 2 for 1 when you go to target one of your creatures. If they destroy that creature in response, then the Monstrous Rage fizzles, right? So instead we're running the 4 copies of Shock, and this lets ourselves shoot the 2 costed creatures on our opponent's side if you are coming up against mono red. But you can also just shoot people into the in the face. And we're going back up to the Witchstalker Frenzies at 3, which is what it was at Worlds in the best of 3 deck. And this card allows you to shoot your Screaming Nemesis. Same with the Shock and the Burst Lightnings. So keep that line in mind if you are. It prevents your opponent from gaining life. But be careful, because if they destroy your Nemesis, it does get fizzled. So mono red aggro is favored against Golgari Midrange, Dimir Midrange, which you see more in best of 3. Azorius Oculus and Orsov Bats. It's a coin flip against Boros Burn, which we'll cover here shortly, and it's weak to mono black midrange, Boros Auras, and mono white control. The opening hand is the Heartfire Hero and the Hired Claw, and if you have the Heartfire Hero, then it increases the power of having the Manifold Mouse on turn 2. All right, number 2 is Boros Auras. Again, if you've been watching throughout the weeks, these guys have kind of been solidly in Tier 1 for a while now. And this week we see they dropped 1 copy of the Emberheart Challenger to bring in 3 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, and dropping the Atali's Favor on the top end. And we've seen this kind of come back and forth depending on the pace of the week, basically. And we're dropping some of the budget lands, so this week not running the Abraded Bluffs, and dropping 1 mountain and 1 plains to bring in the more expensive Pain Lands of Battlefield Forge, and the two additional copies of Thran Portal. And this one is favored against mono red aggro and Golgari Midrange, Azorius Oculus, and Boros Burn. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, and it's weak against mono black midrange. So mono black midrange has the interaction to pop the targets and get 2-for-1s, which makes it good against mono red aggro and Boros Auras. And so the opening hand for this one is Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts. Selesnya Rabbits is in number 3, and as you climb the ladder, I think it's number 1 actually in Diamond. Depends on how much of the good matchups you're coming up against, right? Like the more mono black that you're coming up against, the better the go wide strategy is. And last week we saw the Selesnya Rabbits were exploring kind of a lower curve and going in a different direction with the deck, and we can see this is kind of returned back to the more typical build of Selesnya Rabbits, the more consistent build of Selesnya Rabbits. And so this one's running 3 copies of Phineas instead of 4, and going back up to 4 copies of Knight Errant of Eos, dropping the Llanowar Elves, so not trying any silly ramp or anything like that. Going back to the Sanguine Evangelist and bringing in the Seasoned Wearing Guard, and the 2 copies of the Warren War Leader, and dropping the Requisition Raid, and going back to the Season of the Burrow, and dropping the In the Trenches, and dropping the 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts. And I will be posting my gameplay video of Selesnya Rabbits. I've been playing around with a couple of alternative builds in this archetype, and I feel like I'm getting close to something there. I personally, I've been really liking the Sheltered by Ghosts, so definitely, give it a shot if you haven't tried some of these suggestions, and see what works for you. And as far as the lands go, we're dropping back to the normal lands, so dropping the Fabled Passage, the Forest, the Hushwood Verge, and bringing back in the Brushland and the Lupine Flower Village, and the full 4 copies of the Oak Hollow Village, because we don't have the Llanowar Elves anymore, and then just 3 basic planes. Selesnya Rabbits is favored against anything that's heavy in interaction, so Golgari Midrange, Dimir Midrange, Mono Black Discard. It's a coin flip against Mono Black Midrange, which leans a little bit more heavily into the Demon package, and which this deck, without the Sheltered by Ghosts, doesn't really have an answer for the 6/6 flyer, other than going wide and around it. It's weak against the mono red aggro and the Boros Auras strategy, again lacking the interaction to disrupt their strategy, which generally gets off the ground a little bit faster, or wins the game a little bit faster than this strategy does. And the opening hand for this one is Valley Mightcaller and the Paw Patch Recruit. You definitely want to be starting on turn 1. The Seasoned Wearing Guard can work in a pinch, but really it's not as good as either of these two. Number 4 in Tier 1 was Mardu Aggro. And again, the tiers really just mean that they're statistically comparable to one another. They're within a standard deviation. And so Mardu Aggro is kind of like the Boros Auras strategy, but then adding in the Callous Sellsword, so that we were able to fling your large Voltron creature at your opponent. And do remember that it synergizes with Heartfire Hero, dealing 3 times its power. Don't forget that. So we do see some changes finally happening to this archetype. It's been stable for several weeks, and our Emberheart Challenger got dropped here by 1 to bring in 2 additional copies of the Callous Sellsword, and we're also running a 3rd copy, 1 additional copy of the Demonic Ruckus. And to make room for this, we're dropping the lands down a little bit and dropping out the 2 Thran portals. So this strategy is favored against mono red aggro, being able to usually close the game out a turn sooner because of the Callous Sellsword, and it's also favored against Golgari Midrange and Azorius Oculus. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras, largely being the same deck, kind of who gets the Sheltered by Ghosts down first, and then it's weak against Mono Black Midrange, again because of the interaction blowing up any of your targeted auras. So the opening hand for this one is the same. It's the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts. And number 5 in Tier 1 is Rakdos Aggro. We've seen this one kind of dip down into the bottom of Tier 2 and then come back up into Tier 1. Depends on how much interaction is in the meta right now. And so this one was number 5. And we do see this one There's a couple of changes kind of going back to the build that happened before Foundations, where so we've dropped the Emberheart Challenger from 4 down to 2. We've dropped the Blazing Crescendo and the Might of the Meek, which helps with that dig. We're bringing in the Dreadmaw's Ire, which helps with getting the turn 3 win. And we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Turn Inside Out, which also helps with getting the turn 3 win. And we're dropping the Mirren Bane Splitters to run the Urbrask's Forge, which can kind of help the game go a little bit longer and resist some of the interaction if that like Mono Black tends to struggle with ways to destroy the Urbrask's Forge. And then we're dropping the Demonic Ruckus to bring it and the Sulphurous Springs to bring in 3 mountains. So again, this strategy, sometimes you'll see the black lands included. It's not necessary. If you have them, I think it doesn't really hurt to run the black lands, because occasionally you do kind of blow things up and then play Callous Sellsword out as a large threat. It's probably 1 in 100 games or something like that. But this strategy, similar to the Mardu Aggro, is favored against Mono Red Aggro, Azorius Oculus, and Golgari Midrange. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras, depending on whether or not they get the Shelter by Ghosts and are on the play. And then it's weak to Mono Black Midrange and Mono Black Discard. Again, struggling with the interaction. So the opening hand for this one is the Emberheart Challenger and the Heartfire Hero. And Monstrous Rage is close. I think it's number 3. Number 6, and the top of tier 2 is Mono Black Midrange. Again, this one is preying on all of the decks that I just talked about, basically, except for the Selesnya Rabbits, which is closer to a coin flip. But Mono Black Midrange is still a decent deck. If you're in tier 2, you can still definitely climb. It's well above a 50% win rate, so you can grind your way up the Mythic ladder. So this one, this week, is dropping the 2 copies of the Liliana of the Veil and 1 copy of the Bloodletter of Aclazotz to bring in 2 more copies of the Archfiend of the Dross and the 2 copies of Sheoldred the Apocalypse. Both of these doing a pretty good job against Mono Red. And then Duress coming down 1 to bring in 1 copy of Rush of Dread. And if you've seen my gameplay video on Mono Black, I was actually running 2 Rush of Dreads, I think, without the Aclazotz. But this is like a 1-turn kill. It's a combo we've had since Outlaws of Thunder Junction. But anyway, this card, I really like the versatility of this, whether or not you're using it as an edict or just using it to burst them for lethal. Been pretty impressed with Rush of Dread, so I definitely think you should check it out. Cut Down, we've got 2 less copies of the Cut Down, and that might be because we've seen a little bit of a decrease in popularity in Mono Red, at least from Bronze to Mythic. Again, certain spots, like I played 5 games of Mono Red the very first match I played, or first couple of games I played today in the Diamond 4 or whatever. So you'll still bump into pockets of red, but overall I think that cut downs going from 4 to 2 kind of signal to me that there's more rabbits and such where the cut downs are not as good. We're bringing in the 2 additional copies of the Go for the Throat, for example, and this helps out with again, like more of the mirror match. And we're bringing in we're dropping 2 copies of Nowhere to Run, which is the enchantment that can get kind of through ward or hexproof, good against the Shelter by Ghosts. And we're taking out a Mirrex and 2 Swamps to bring in a Mishra's Foundry, a Fountain Port, and 2 Cavern of Souls. So going up in the land count. And this strategy is favored against Mono Red Aggro, Boros Auras, Mono Black Discard, and Boros Burn, having plenty of interaction. It's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange, and it's weak against Dimir Midrange, Azorius Oculus, Mono White Control, and Domain. And its opening hand is largely your 1-drop, so this one's not running Tiny Bones. If you are running Tiny Bones, that's a good one to have in your opening hand. Otherwise, you're looking for your cheap interaction like Cut Down and your value like Unholy Annex. Number 7 here is Gruul Prowess, and this is the first time that we've actually talked about Gruul Prowess, so it took a month to show up in the top 8. It usually makes its rounds eventually. Typically a deck that you see more commonly in best of 3 than you do in best of 1. But so this one, yeah, was tier 2, and Since it's a new archetype in Best of One, new archetype, the matchup data is not available. It's very similar to the Heartfire Hero strategy that we see in Mono Red, with the Manifold Mouse and the Emberheart Challenger being able to pump the Heartfire Hero and the Valiant triggers of Emberheart Challenger to dig for additional value. The upside to this strategy is that it's a little bit more resilient to the single point interaction of black, being able to respond with the Snakeskin Veil to protect one of your targets, and then Innkeeper's Talent is a way to kind of go later into the game by repeatedly triggering your Valiant triggers, and then the Questing Druid helps up against the non-aggro matchups. So some people were asking, like, when do you run the Questing Druid and when do you not in Best of 3? Typically, in Best of 3, you want to run the Questing Druid against mid-range decks and control decks, where you have time to take the time off to seek the beast and do the adventure side. When you're up against aggro, playing a 1/1 for 2 or doing something that doesn't develop the board and just digging for 2 mana is usually enough for your opponent to gain an edge and win the game. So I hope that answers your questions. And I almost forgot. The matchup data aren't available, but I do know what the opening hand, what you should be looking for in this strategy. So that's Heartfire Hero and Monastery Swiftspear and Monstrous Rage. All right, and the last Best of One deck that I'll be covering this week is Mono White Lifegain. And this one is going in a different direction. And I think that if you blend the two, there's a viable strategy here that could actually see its way into tier 1. So last week we were kind of covering the Mono White Lifegain that was running the Leyline of Hope. And this one is not running the Leyline of Hope, but instead is leaning more into card draw, which the other deck struggles with and can kind of run out of gas if they do something like a Temporary Lockdown or a Wrath, right? So this one's dropping the Knight Errant of Eos and the Leonin Vanguard and the Linden, the Steadfast Queen, which is the triple white. Whenever white creature attacks, you gain a life. Leonin Vanguard is the one that gains a life if you have 3 or more creatures and gets +1/+1. And Knight Errant of Eos is the one that convokes and allows you to dig for each creature that it gets discounted for the convoke. And Cat Collector, this is a new one. So Cat Collector, whenever it enters when this creature enters, you create a food token, and then if you gain life for the first time during each of your turns, not each turn, each of your turns, create a 1/1 white cat creature token. So if you pop the food token in your opponent's turn, you will not get the 1/1, and I've seen people screw this up in draft, probably more so than in constructed. Enduring Innocence, we've seen this with like the mono white decks where the Carrot Cake and Caretaker's Talent kind of thing goes. This one has lifelink, so it works into the life gain strategy, but then it also works with like the Cat Collector creating these 1/1 tokens that then help us with the card draw. And you could also create tokens off of like the Fountain Port, for example. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Lorn of the Third Path, and I think this one is particularly like on the chopping block personally. It really depends on how much Urabrask's Forge and Caretaker's Talent and Unholy Annex you're coming into. And for example, like in Mono Red, this is a 2/1 for 3. It's not great. We're dropping the 4 copies of the Leyline of Hope to bring in the 4 copies of Case of the Uneaten Feast. And again, I think this is another one that I haven't been impressed with. So you can go look at my mono white Lifegain build and maybe play around with like bringing in Enduring Innocence or the Cat Collector. Like, I do like the idea of getting a little bit of card draw in there, but I'm a little bit unimpressed with the Case of the Uneaten Feast and the Lorn of the Third Path. But I try to remove my bias and stay with just what the tracker said. So this one was the top performing deck, Bronze the Mythic, according to the tracker. So as far as the lands go, we dropped 2 planes to bring in 4 Fountain Port. So we're bringing up the land to kind of have a little bit more mana to do fun stuff with the cards that we're drawing. So this strategy absolutely destroys mono red aggro. So if you're bumping into a bunch of mono red, try out some mono white Lifegain. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras and Golgari Midrange. Again, kind of just depends on whether or not you can get the Sheltered by Ghosts down around the Golgari Midrange interaction, or if you're going, if you can get the Sheltered Ghosts down before they do for Boros Auras. It's weak against mono black midrange, struggling similar to the Boros Auras strategy. If they just pop your early threats, this can take a little while to get off the ground with your Essence Channeler and your Pride Mate. So kind of weak to interaction. and so it's also weak to mono black discard. The version that's drawing cards might be a little bit better against mono black discard because the matchups are based off of the average, and I think this is yet to really take its final form, so we'll see. And the opening hand for this one is Leyline of Hope, if you are running that one. The Hinterland Sanctifier is particularly nice to have in your opening hand, especially if you have the Essence Channeler. And then we have the Healer's Hawk and the Runelurker Bats are another cheap evasive flyers to get in for the lifelink. And if you have the Leon Vanguard, I've been pretty impressed with that in the opening hand too. So the upside to this strategy is there's a fair amount of cards that you can hit in your opening hand, and you don't have to mulligan that often to hit the sweet spot. All right, and now for best of 3. So in best of 3, what I like to do is I like to use the Standard Challenge, which is a tournament that is quite popular on Magic the Gathering Online, and usually has some of the top players in Magic the Gathering playing in those tournaments. So I would use the best of 1 or best of 3 untapped tracker, but what I've found is that it kind of just lags behind what's happening on the Standard Challenge. But I'll do my best to talk about how these decks apply to MTG Arena instead of the Standard Challenge, because there's some slight subtleties and differences in the meta between the tournaments and between the ladder on Arena. So I'll do my best to kind of bridge the gap. So we see a pretty good spread this week. There are 3 versions of Dimir Midrange. So Dimir Midrange has been doing quite well, both on the Arena ladder and in the tournament scene. And there was kind of a rock, paper, scissors thing going on in best of 3. So just really quickly for the history kind of rundown, prior to rotation, basically you had Golgari Midrange was getting beaten out by Domain. Domain was then getting beaten out by Azorius Control. Azorius Control was then getting beaten out by Dimir Midrange, and then Dimir Midrange gets beaten out by the aggro decks like Mono Red Aggro, Gruul Prowess, Rakdos Lizards, whatever flavor of aggro were a faster pace than Dimir Midrange. And we saw... So that's kind of where we're at right now, is that like we see aggro kind of sweep in, and then we see Dimir Midrange fall down, and then once the aggro kind of goes away, we see the Dimir Midrange pop back up. So that's what we're seeing this week, and I hope that helps. So this one was Dimir Midrange by Bernard Oxa, and went number 1 on the 6th. And if we compare this one to the deck that I covered last week, the first version, we can see that they changed very few cards here. So we've got 1 less Mockingbird and bringing in 2 Feybloom Tricks. And I like the Feybloom Trick in Draft. I've been really impressed with it. I haven't tried it out in Constructed yet, but it works into the tempo strategy, gives you 1/1 flyers, which then help you draw additional value off of your Gix Yawgmoth Praetor if you're running it, or your Enduring Curiosity. So could be a really cool fit. Curious to see if this one actually stays throughout the weeks. And to make room for 2 of them, since we're just dropping 1 Mockingbird, we're also dropping 1 Soulstone Sanctuary. And the best of 3 sideboard, we also saw very few changes. Anoint with Affliction got dropped for a Blotout. And Blotout works really well in the mirror match, so if you're playing Dimir Midrange and expecting a lot of Dimir Midrange, this helps you hit your Enduring Curiosity and get it gone forever, as well as Aclazotz if they're running it. And then the Ghost Vacuum is getting dropped from this list, which was for against Azorius Oculus, and we've kind of seen Azorius Oculus fall out of popularity. And we're bringing in 1 additional Preacher of the Schism. Again, this one is one that is nice to bring in against the aggro matchups that can kind of struggle with the 4 toughness and the death touch. The lifelink can help you stabilize, and it can also help you out in certain matchups where the card draw matters too, right? So all in all, I'll eventually, I think, get around to doing a full Dimir Midrange sideboard guide. I haven't yet, but I probably should. But Preacher of the Schism, yeah, you're looking to bring those in against the like if you bring it out and they just like destroy it, it feels pretty bad. So it kind of depends on like how many go for the throats and what kind of matchup like that you're looking at. Because like against black, or against red, it's a little bit harder, etc. Depends on if they're running the Exercise or the Destroy Evil, and yeah. to further explain on that, like Exercise doesn't kill the Preacher of the Schism, so that would be good to bring it in. If they're running the Destroy Evil, it kills 4 toughness, so you wouldn't want to bring in Preacher then. So there's some complications to the sideboard in Dimir Midrange that I'm still working with. Anyway, I digress. So Domain got a number 2 finish here on the 6th as well by Got Muse. And if we compare this one to week 2, so we didn't see any in the top 8 tournament finishes last week, but it doesn't mean it's a bad deck, right? So if we compare this one to week 2, we see that they decided to drop the 2 copies of Scroll Shift, which allows you to kind of blink your impending enchantments and have them come in as their full copies. And instead of the Scroll Shift, we're bringing in the 2 copies of Elspeth's Smite. And this just helps up against the aggro matchups, right? The strategy is still the same. Use Zur to enchant your, big impending enchantments. Remember that if you play something for impending, it still gives you the mana value of the 5. So if you do the impending for 3 here, it counts as a 5 mana cost spell. So it will trigger your Up the Beanstalk, which is kind of cool. And the domain, the Overlord of the Hauntwoods, immediately gives you a land, which gives you the domain, which then makes your leyline cheaper and gives you the full domain for herd migration. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we also see very few changes. So we're dropping we're moving the 2 Elspeth Smite to the main, and we're dropping 1 Pop Hatch formation to bring in 2 copies of the Chromehose Sea Shark and 1 Kaya Intangible Slayer. Now, Kaya Intangible Slayer is one that you're going to want to bring in against the white rafts, any of the creature-centric board wipes. Kaya Intangible Slayer is pretty nice to not get affected by those. And then the Chromehose Sea Shark, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you incubate and you create a token. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which matchups I would like to run the Chromehose Sea Shark in, and I think that one kind of it helps you go wide. It can help you kind of go wide against decks that have the early pressure, and the 2/4 flyer can be really good for gumming up the air for decks like Dimir Midrange. But the last time that I played Domain with Chromehose Sea Shark was back when Jeskai or Boros Convoke was a strategy, right? So it's been a little bit since I need to brush the cobwebs off of my my Domain. And speaking of Boros Convoke, next up is Jeskai Convoke by the Witch King, and this is kind of or the Witch Kling. Did I miss it? Whatever. This one got number 1 on the 7th, and we haven't talked about this one in Foundations yet, so I'll talk about this one. It's basically Boros Convoke. And since we lost the Voldaren Epicure in rotation, we're playing 3 colors to play the Spyglass Siren. And that's how important being able to create an artifact on turn 1 is, so that on turn 2 you can blow it up with Gleeful Demolition and play a white creature, and then on turn 2, after you do that, you Knight Errant to Eos for 5, and then on turn 3 you Immodane's Recruiter and you win. if all goes according to plan. If everything doesn't quite go according to plan, then you can turn 1 Novice Inspector, turn 2 Resolute Reinforcements, and then turn 3 play something in Knight Errant Vios, and then you usually get it by turn 4, or more consistently. The cards that we got that were new, right? Sheltered by Ghosts got added into the archetype, and it started out with 1 copy and then 2, and now it's all the way up to a full playset. This card is nuts, and again, you'll notice in my gameplay video in my Selesnya Rabbits, I have been playing a full playset, and I just think that if you're in white, you should be playing this card. We're also seeing the Clockwork Percussionist is a nice one that we got in Duskmourn that works nicely into this archetype, giving you the artifact creature, kind of like the Yoshin Frontliner, the little 1/1 colorless guy, because you can hit it with the Gleeful Demolition, but then this one also gives you the dig. So, yeah, enough with that strategy. The sideboard has more blue in it than just the Spyglass Siren. One of the nice things about bringing in the blue is that we get to run Protect the Negotiators, which allows us to kind of protect our board from cards like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall and the Rafts, which this deck can kind of struggle against. Disdainful Stroke, again, against Sunfall. Destroy Evil, if you're up against Preacher of the Schism. 4 copies of Torch the Tower helps exile problematic threats like anything that's kind of an annoyingly sticky card, Slasher, Enduring Curiosity. You can also bring this in against the aggro matchups if you're up against like Mono Red or Gruul Prowess or Dimir Midrange. And then Split Up is good for any of the aggro board centric strategies. You're not going to want to bring this one in against the slower mid-range control matchups. Oh, and it just dawned on me I didn't do the matchups for... Yeah, all right. This week we're not going to do the matchups for best of... Well, I guess I could talk about it right now. All right. We haven't gone too far in. All right. So, Dimir Midrange is favored against Golgari Midrange and Boros Burn. It's a coin flip against Azorius Oculus and Temur Prowess, which is like the Flood Caller deck. I call it, Temur Prowess. But you could call it the Flood Caller combo deck. And then it's weak against Mono Red Aggro and Domain, Mono White Control, Gruul Prowess, and Simic Beanstalk. And so, yeah, I kind of talked about that one with the Rock, Paper, Scissors of like how we've seen kind of things fluctuate throughout the weeks. Domain, on the other hand, is favored against Golgari Midrange and Dimir Midrange and Mono White Control and Azorius Oculus and Simic Beanstalk. It's a coin flip against Temur Prowess, and then it struggles against Mono Red Aggro, Boros Burn, and Gruul Prowess. So when we see a increase in aggro, we'll also, a decrease in aggro, we'll see a spike in Dimir Midrange and Domain, right? Jeskai Convoke that I just talked about is favored against Golgari Midrange and Dimir Midrange because it punishes the one-for-one single-point interaction of those strategies by going wide, similar to Selesnya Rabbits in Best of One. It's a coin flip against Domain, kind of depends on whether or not you can get the turn 3 or the turn 4 win before they hit into their temporary lockdown or the Sunfall. And then it's weak against Mono Red Aggro. So like Dimir Midrange, the Jeskai Convoke tends to go away the more aggro that we're seeing in the meta. Okay. So with that being said, here's the second version of Dimir Midrange. And if we compare this one to last week, we can see that this one dropped Kaido, Bane of Nightmares, and one copy of the Enduring Curiosity, as well as one copy of the Mockingbird, and the 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder to bring in 2 copies of the Azure Beastbinder. And this one shuts down things like Urabrask's Forge. There's a lot of different targets that the Beastbinder is a pretty good answer to. Excuse me. And then Shieldred the Apocalypse, which helps up against the aggro strategies like Mono Red. So I think with both the Beastbinder and the Shieldred, I'm expecting that there was more of an aggro spike because we saw the Dimir Midrange win. More people started playing aggro strategies, and these cards help the Dimir Midrange matchup against the aggro. We've got one less copy of Go for the Throat, and we're bringing in one more copy of Anoint with Affliction, which is a good answer to stuff like Unstoppable Slasher. And we're bringing in one Anoint with Affliction, or sorry, I just said that one, to change the equations. Now, this one's one that we don't usually see. Counter target spell with mana value 2 or less, or counter target red or green spell with mana value 6 or less. So this one could be coming in to help out the matchup with against the Domain, so that you can block the ramp off of the Overlord of the Hauntwoods. And but it's got a couple of hits that can be useful. Don't usually see it included, so I'm curious to see how. I mean, it obviously worked for them if they got number 2 in the tournament, right? So they dropped 1 Soulstone Sanctuary and instead are running a Fountain Port. And this has, depends on the matchup, but there's pros and cons to these 2 cards, right? Fountain Port gives you a little bit more of the late game value instead of just a threat and a way to close the game. The best of 3 sideboard is, we see Anoint with Affliction gets dropped, same with Cut Down, Disfigure, and Shieldred the Apocalypse. And we're bringing in a Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. And we'll see this one kind of come in and come out, depending on, just how much aggro there is in the matchups. So for you on the ladder, Mono Red tends to be a pretty popular one, so you could, consider running the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. And This one is running an additional copy of Ghost Vacuum, so this one helps out against the aggro or the graveyard centric strategies like Azorius Oculus. And then we've got one additional copy of the Preacher of the Schism. Again, I like that one against the aggro matchups. And Shieldred the Apocalypse, again for aggro. Okay, and then the third and final version is Dimir Midrange by Tyism. And that previous list was by Mr. Man. I'm a little scattered this week, I apologize. So this one took down first on the 7th, and if we compare this one to last week, you can see that they also took down the Enduring Curiosity from 4 to 3, dropped the Mockingbirds entirely, as well as the one Tishana's Tidebinder, and brought in 3 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, and draw 2 copies of Duress in the main. And we dropped the Spell Stutters and brought in the Phantom Interference. Again, we kind of see that one go back and forth depending on whether or not people are expecting Spell Stutter or if they're expecting the Phantom Interference. And then we're dropping the Soulstone Sanctuary for the Fountain Port. The best of 3 sideboard was Anoint with Affliction got cut out, 1 Blot Out got cut out, 1 Cut Down, 1 Disfigure, 2 Duress, 1 Preacher of the Schism to bring in an additional copy of Gix's Command. This one works against the go wide strategies. Like if we're starting to see more Jeskai Convoke, then you'll see more Gix's Command. It also works pretty well against mono white tokens, the control matchup, because by wiping their board, anything that has a kind of a go wide quality, Gix's Command is pretty good to answer. We also see Malicious Eclipse, which also helps with the go wide strategies, and we see the End. And this one's good for anything like, the Temur Prowess deck, the combo piece. Like if you remove the Otter, then the Stormcaller, the whole strategy comes crashing down, right? So there's a couple of matchups a couple of decks that if you remove one key piece, they all kind of come crashing down, right? So good against the combo decks. And we also see 3 steps ahead. Not sure which archetype you're going to bring this one in, but generally mid-range or control, where you can kind of afford to play the more expensive cancel instead of the quench of the Phantom Interference. And cancel's 1 in double blue for those who haven't been playing Magic forever. And Tishana's Tidebinder in the sideboard. This one, again, matchup dependent, but you can do things like silence Urbrask's Forge, you can silence Planeswalkers, you can silence the 6/6 coming off of the Unholy Annex once. Remember, it doesn't silence it forever because it's not an artifact, creature, or Planeswalker. But there's a lot of different creative things that you can hit with the Tishana's Tidebinder, and you're going to bring that in specific matchups. And then the Withering Torment you're going to bring in if you're needing some enchantment hate. All right, here we go. We're almost there. Now we're on to second place on the 7th for the second tournament. And this one is Golgari Midrange by Claudio. And if we compare this one to last week, we see a substantial amount of change happening to Golgari Midrange. So if you're a fan of the rock, definitely pay attention to this one this week. We're moving away from the Unholy Annex in both versions of Golgari Midrange this week. And I find that very interesting, and so we'll see where they went with this. So we're dropping the Archfiend of the Dross because we're getting rid of the demon synergies. We're bringing in an additional Preacher of the Schism. Golgari Midrange is favored against the more aggro strategies like Boros Burn and Gruul Prowess. So Preacher of the Schism kind of helps in that matchup as well, kind of makes it even better against that matchup. Sentinel of the Nameless City, usually we see this included if we have the Caustic Broncos, but that was because of the Unholy Annex being able to hit your opponent for 8, right? So we're running the Sentinel of the Nameless Cities even though we don't have the Caustic Broncos or the Unholy Annex, and we're bringing in 2 copies of the Swarm Weaver, and this one was like a really creative one that we got in Duskmourn that I haven't seen played yet in Constructed. When it enters, you create 2 1/1 green tokens with flying, and then if you have Delirium, which is if there's 4 or more card types in your graveyard, then your insects get +1/+1 and have Death Touch. And I don't think there's any other insect kind of synergies in this one. So but it still gives you like 3 bodies for 1 card, and it's not too difficult to turn on Delirium in the grind fest that is Golgari Midrange. So I'm not sure that the Swarmweaver is here to stay, but fun to see regardless. And then they decided to drop one Maelstrom Pulse from last week and brought in 2 Duress in the main. And this one just kind of depends on how how non-creature centric the strategies are in the meta right now. Shoot the Sheriff got dropped, and we brought in Anoint with Affliction. Anoint with Affliction is able to hit things that are value 3 or less, whereas Shoot the Sheriff is like a non-outlaw creature. So they just have different targets, but they're both 1 and a black instant speed interaction. Blot Out, again, good against the Dimir Midrange decks, which have been quite popular. Cut Down, going up to 3 copies from 2, and bringing 1 Tear Asunder in the main, and a Nowhere to Run, and dropping the 4 Unholy Annex Ritual Chambers, the 2 Virtue of Persistence, or the Lochthwain Scorns, and then the Demolition Field, the Forest, and a Swamp for 2 Fountain Ports. So substantial different approach to the archetype. And the best of 3 sideboard, we also see a pretty significant change. So we're dropping the Acklesot's Deepest Betrayal, the Anoint with Affliction, the Cut Down, the Duress, the Ghost Vacuum, and the 2 Tear Asunders to bring in the Choking Miasmas, 2 copies of Choking Miasma. Again, good against the go wide strategies of like Jeskai Convoke and Mono White control. And Harvester of Misery, same. And bringing in Liliana Dreadhorde General. And this is kind of just an alternative threat if you're up against White Wraths, which Golgari Midrange can kind of struggle against. If you're coming up against the Wraths, you sub into your Planeswalkers. And then Thrun, Breaker of Silence, can't be countered and can't be the target of non-green spells. So this one specifically can be very difficult for your opponent to deal with and has Indestructible. During your turn, has Indestructible. And then we have 1 additional copy of the Tranquil Frillback. Good against aggro to gain 4 life, good against Azorius Oculus to exile their graveyard, and good against the Unholy Annex or Caretaker's Talent, Urbresk's Forge. Generally, there's enough matchups where the Tranquil Frillback is worth it that some people even include it in the main. So Golgari Midrange in general is favored against Boros Burn and Gruul Prowess and the earlier aggro strategies. It's a coin flip against Mono Red Aggro and Azorius Oculus, and then it's weak against Dimir Midrange, Domain, Mono White Control, Simic Beanstalk, and Temur Prowess. But keep that with an asterisk that is Golgari Midrange especially is one that loses the first game in a lot of matchups and then sideboards very well into a favored matchup and goes 1-2-2, especially at the higher end of play, right? May not be the best ladder deck, especially if you're not very familiar with sideboarding. But yeah, that's kind of where it fits into the meta. All right, number 15 is Gruul Prowess by JRod115. Went number 1 on the 8th, which was the Sunday tournament. And if we compare this one to week 2, which is the last time we saw Gruul Prowess, we can see that they've gone back to the mono red version. That's not really even Gruul until you get to the sideboard. So we're dropping the Questing Druid. We're bringing in 4 Hired Claws. We're dropping 2 Bushwhack, 2 Might of the Meek, 2 Snakeskin Veils to bring in the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy. And then we're dropping the red, some of the green lands, so like the Carplusian Forest and the Restless Ridgeline to bring in 3 copies of Mountains and 2 Rock-Face Villages. The best of 3 sideboard, we've seen this before where actually Mono Red was running just the Paw Patch formation. This one is also deciding to run the Questing Druid, but otherwise is Mono Red. And so we drop the Innkeeper's Talent, the Pick Your Poison, 2 copies of the Scorching Shot, and 1 Snakeskin Veil. And instead of running 2 additional Paw Patch formations, so going all the way up to 4 with these. Again, this is a particularly good one against the Domain decks, Mono Black Midrange, anything that's running the Unholy Annex. This one's a pretty good one to sub into. The Twisted Fealties, this one, I did a sideboard guide for Gruul Aggro. Twisted Fealty is good against like Azorius Oculus. It's good against the big flyers, the 6/6 flyers. It's less good against the. It's not good at all against the go wide strategies like mono white control and Jeskai Convoke. So if they have a really big juicy target to take, then Twisted Fealty looks a lot better. And then Urbesk's Forge, you're going to bring this one. Some people like to bring it in against mono red. Some people like to bring it in against like Dimir Midrange. Some people like to just bring it in against like a hope and a prayer against mono white control. So there's a couple of different matches where you're going to bring in the Forge depending on how good they are with dealing with it. And Gruul Prowess is favored against Dimir Midrange, Domain, Boros Burn, Simic Beanstalk, Temur Prowess, Azorius Oculus. This of course is based off of ladder data, where people are worse at sideboarding, which means this deck does better the worse people are sideboarding. It's a coin flip against mono white control and weak against Golgari Midrange and mono red aggro. And woo, man, what a day. What a day and what a week of Magic. All right, we're on to the 16th deck, and it's Golgari Midrange by Lucas G1 GGS, or GGs. Went number 2 on the 18th, or I keep saying that, on the 8th. Need to get my eyes checked. If we compare this one to Claudio, so this one is closer to the same list that we saw on Saturday, rather than comparing it to last week. If we compare it to the one that I just covered, we can see that some similarities, but went in a slightly different direction. So they're dropping Vivian Reed in the main, so no green Planeswalker there. We're dropping 1 Preacher of the Schism and 1 Sentinel of the Nameless City, and the 2 Swarm Weavers. To bring in Akelzot's Deepest Betrayal and 1 Harvester of Misery in the main, as well as Shieldred the Apocalypse, 1 additional copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, and then we're running Thrun or Thrun, Breaker of Silence in the main, dropping 1 Duress and 1 Tear Asunder, and bringing in an additional copy of Anoint with Affliction, and bringing in 1 Virtue of Persistence, and dropping a Forest for a Soulstone Sanctuary and a Swamp. So running one additional land in comparison to Claudio. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we've got the Anoint with Affliction is gone, the Duress is gone, Liliana Dreadhorde General, 1 Maelstrom Pulse, and 1 less copy of Thrun, Breaker of Silence. And instead we're running an additional copy of Cutdown for against aggro, 1 additional copy of Liliana the Veil for against control, 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist. This one's also good against white control. 1 Tear Asunder, good against enchantment and artifact strategies, and 1 copy of The End if you're playing up against a combo deck like Temur Prowess. All right. Thanks for listening to my ramblings. I hope you all find it useful. I do enjoy doing these every week, and I think I went a little bit late. I went a little bit over. We got a little bit rambly this week, which I tend to do. So with that, yeah, gameplay videos, if I can manage to get them done in time. Selesnya Rabbits version 2 coming down the pipeline tomorrow. It's still gonna kick the can down the road for the community deck techs because Christmas and holidays like this time of year is crazy. We'll get back to that though eventually, and I'll let you know by sending out the bat signal in the community tab. Sideboard guides, as I get to them, will be done in the community tab as well. And then if you ever want to come by and say hi on a weekend, I typically stream sometime on Saturday or Sunday on Twitch if you want to come by and say hi. And with that, thanks for being a part of my community. Have a wonderful week, and go kick ass and take names, and good luck crushing the ladder. Take care, everybody.